Hey,
Hello, Matt.
We really have to work out that opening, don't we? I think I should be the one to open it, but okay.
We can start over. We keep rolling. And
No,
what's it like when you do it? Let the people judge.
I don't want to destroy the facade, not the facade, the reality here that this is all live, that we just let it roll. So let's let it roll. How are you doing in Northern DMZ, Bill?
Well, it's not the best week for Massachusetts.
That's right. Now, how far are you from Boston proper?
I mean, I'm far. I'm 2 hours away, and Western Mass is like another world from Boston. But there are a lot of people here who have Boston ties. I'm not one of them, so I don't have the same. I don't have the same sense of emotional connection to Patriots Day, and I don't have childhood memories of taking the day off and seeing the Red Sox at 11 a.m. or seeing the marathon. So I'm not in that boat, and there are a lot of transplants here like me, but. You do have some residual kinship. It is in the same state. There are people here with Boston ties. There are people here that go run the marathon or take a trip to see the Red Sox. It is part of Red Sox Nation. So certainly people are unsettled, but at the same token, there is a sense of solidarity, and we're not going to let this. There's no talk of canceling the marathon next year. I think people are.
Someone on Twitter, I don't know who said it on Twitter, but someone said that there's no group of people, no city that I would want to piss off. That I would at least be less inclined to want to piss off than Bostonians. Which reminded me of the line from Casablanca, where Bogart advises the Nazis there's some neighborhoods in New York that they might not want to invade or something like that.
Now, I lived in New York during 9/11, and it so happened I was out of town on 9/11. Normally, I would have been on the subway, underground, right around where the Trade Center was, and by happenstance, I wasn't. But I came back home, not too long after, and back then there was serious conversation to cancel the mayoral election because New York couldn't stand to be without Rudy Giuliani for a day.
Well, I remember, and Rudy Giuliani, as I recall, was pushing that idea as well, or am I wrong about that? I seem to recall Rudy.
I think he made a suggestion to it. He didn't quite outright say we're going to do this, but he sort of hinted at it, and it was taken seriously. I mean, it really is, quite frankly, an absurd notion that you would cancel your democracy in the face of a terrorist attack, and an absurd notion that if only this one person is in charge, that this is the only thing keeping the glue of the city together. It's a pretty disturbing notion of what makes societies function. So I do think we have progressed as a country beyond such panic, knee-jerk responses to terrorism. And I think people have a much better sense of, what, day 2, 3, and 4 looks like after what is obviously a traumatic event.
I wanted to talk about new media and Twitter a little bit and how it impacted it. Because, as you know, I've written a piece about why I hate Twitter at the week, and I argue that it's sort of Twitter's a double-edged sword. There are great things about it and there are horrible things about it. And I think one thing it's clear that Twitter broke the news. I think most people probably, a lot of people learned about it. The first people who learned about it probably learned about this on Twitter. And Twitter was way ahead of, for example, cable TV. I think we, monitoring Twitter, knew about what happened in Boston, maybe 30 minutes or so before any TV referenced it. I think that's true. That's my recollection, at least. But then, of course, you later on have a lot of disinformation being spread on Twitter. You have people, I think, being snarky, saying kind of inappropriate things on Twitter. You have some bogus accounts intentionally set up to take advantage of this horrific event. So Twitter really is the best and worst. And I also think someone pointed this out, that when an event like this happens, the country usually comes together, and it used to take a few days before people would start bickering. But Twitter has really sped that up to where it's a matter of minutes or hours before people start fighting on Twitter.
Right. I mean, Twitter has a role to play, but the notion that it's going to supplant actual journalism is ridiculous. And it was within, I think, 5 minutes of this happening where I'm seeing on my Twitter feed, where is cable TV? Why are they not covering this? Twitter is doing everything. And it's like, journalists have to actually, journalism is not just sticking a camera there and then just watching. That's not journalism. That's voyeurism.
Right.
Journalists have to actually try to figure out what is going on.
And there's so much misinformation that always comes out of these things at first. And Mother Jones, and I'm sure others, but Mother Jones, I thought, give them some props here, had a pretty good rundown of the misinformation that was spread, I think mostly on Twitter. And there's a lot of it. There were some big things that we got wrong, and had there been more time to vet things and report things, then some of those mistakes probably wouldn't have been made. And you also have people, one of them that I remember is Jennifer Rubin, but there were others. I don't want to pick on her, but I just happen to remember hers, where she said tweeted something to the effect of, I'm not going to tweet in about Boston at this point. It's a local news story, which was a dig at one of her colleagues at the Washington Post who said the same thing about the Gosnell abortion trial. And I mean, in another event, that would have been perhaps a nice, snarky observation, but in the context of this horrible, horrific terrorist attack, that it certainly wasn't appropriate. And then, of course, there was all the questioning about whether or not it should be called a terrorist attack, and the fact that Barack Obama didn't initially, was brought up a lot of conversation and controversy.
Well, I want to talk about the whole calling it terrorism thing a little bit more in depth. I just want to finish up the media part of this. I mean, I feel like, forgive me if I'm making just a painfully obvious point, but in any breaking situation, there will be rumors. There will always be rumors. There will always be people who say things with half-baked information that get misinterpreted very quickly.
And sometimes it could even be information that the police or that a source or someone who actually might be in the know says, but they just get it wrong because things are breaking. So it could be a legitimate reporter who hears from a legitimate source. We think that there's X number of people injured. And it could be wildly wrong because it's premature.
Right. And the point of journalism is to examine rumors and make sure they are correct before sharing it with the larger world. And Twitter is just not going to do that. That is not what Twitter is built to do. Twitter is designed, not intentionally, of course, but it's systematically designed to spread rumors.
Right.
So, I was literally seeing in the feed at the same time, OMG, third explosion heard.
Right.
And then separately, controlled explosion done by police. And of course, you have no idea if they're talking about the same thing or not. Of course, you find out later from journalists that, yes, this was a controlled explosion, not actually a third device found.
There were a lot of things like that. And the other thing, Bill, is I went to pretty much media silence within the immediate hours after this happened. I don't think I tweeted very much at all. And part of that's because this isn't my area of expertise. I'm not an expert on counterterrorism. I don't have Boston connected. There's really no reason that you would look to me at this moment to provide insight or analysis. So the other thing, though, Bill, I have this not fear, but it strikes me as unseemly to try to benefit off of this professionally. And I know that politicians try to score points. Barney Frank, I think, questioned whether or not this has something to do with the sequestration. There's another Republican congressman who questioned whether or not we should now stop immigration, visas or immigration reform because, in the wake of Boston. So politicians try to score points, but so do pundits. Sometimes by intentionally being controversial and over the top, or sometimes by just trying to insert themselves and be involved. And, I did write some things the next day, but Bill, I feel really that it's really unseemly to try to kind of assume that I should be, and I'm not in Boston. It's not like I could have gotten downtown. Had I been there, that's a different story. If I had a specific insight, if you can enlighten or advance the story, that's one thing. But to just comment, and Twitter makes it so easy for everyone to just get in their 2 cents. So I don't know how you felt about that. You had radio silence, as I recall.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't feel I have a whole lot to add to this discussion, so I haven't really said anything on Twitter or blog post or elsewhere. But I don't have the same. I have a little higher tolerance for punditry and politicking around this than maybe you do, so long as it is actually factual and relevant. I'm not one to believe that traumatic reality is disconnected from political reality. I mean, the point of politics is to help solve problems. A terrorist attack is a problem. So long as you are offering an opinion or proposal that is useful and relevant and fact based, I'm not offended by that. If you're trying to glom on something that is totally irrelevant, just to ride the story that's in the papers right now, that I do think is unseemly. And I think it's probably unlikely you have enough information within 6 hours of the event to offer a proposal.
And I think that's part of the context, Bill. I mean, we're talking about it today. So obviously I'm not against talking about it, but we have some insight now and some time has passed and we can sort of look back. Mark Aminer yesterday wrote a really good piece at The Week that's probably, I assume, controversial, where he basically says there's nothing in a free society. What happened in Boston can't be stopped. Just get used to it. I mean, there's no way to stop it in a free society. So it's very different than 9/11. I mean, you can disagree or agree, but that's a legitimate viewpoint.
Right.
But it's just the need to instantly weigh in on something like this when you don't have anything to add. And it's a bit narcissistic, I think.
Well, I think there's professional incentive to be first. Be the first, not just to have the first scoop if you're a journalist, but to have the first political idea that benefits from the circumstance. So everyone is sort of trying to find how they can push that boundary,
right,
where it doesn't seem unseemly. So they actually get the attention that they want.
Even if it's unseemly, it doesn't seem to matter that much. I mean, there's actually I think there's even an incentive to say things that are wild and clearly out of bounds, because the rewards are greater than the punishment, I think.
I mean, if you get the attention one way or the other, perhaps that's good enough. But I do think, and I don't look. I mean, journalists have to make a living. Part of their job is to be at the ground zero of events like this, and people want that information. So I don't think they're wrong for falling over themselves to get what information they can. And politicians are there to respond to public outrage about things. I don't blame them for trying to respond to what the people want. But I do think we are missing some element of public service here, where what people want is good information. So they know, maybe just in a most visceral sense, what do I do now? Am I safe right now? Do I need to do something to make myself safe? Or is there something I can actually do to help somebody right now? And politically, is there something that you can do to prevent this kind of thing from happening? And maybe there isn't, to Mark Amberter's point, but if there are things we can do, let's try to figure that out.
Right.
And I think the rush to be first on all these things, I do think obscures. I mean, and the downside is that you induce panic and not calm, collected, useful responses.
Well, and as I said, I mean, Twitter was great at breaking the story initially. But then the problems, and Bill, to address your point, look, I agree. Journalists are assigned to cover things like this, and what I'm talking about is people like me who are not crime reporters, are not assigned to cover something like that, and on a dime go from talking about immigration reform or Mark Sanford to being an expert on terrorism in Boston, and just the punditry that takes place on Twitter by people who really aren't assigned to the story per se. So, but I hear what you're saying, and I agree. And fundamentally, people want information. The public deserves information, and the real problem is the bad information and misinformation.
Now, I do want to pick up what you referenced for about sort of the subdrama. Will Obama use the word terrorism or not? That lasted for about 24 hours. And I mean, I've always thought this notion is sort of generally silly, but I will concede there is a legitimate political debate to be had in regards to our approach to terrorism abroad. What is the best communication strategy to complement the military strategy or the FBI strategy? Because there's two different elements there, and you can make the argument that we need to be very blunt, very axis of evil. We need to call terrorism by its name, kind of thing, if we're to stamp it out. I mean, you can make the case. I think there's the other case say, we need to be careful with our language so we don't inflame the entire region and help Al-Qaeda recruit people because people think we're going after them as a people and not narrowly against Al-Qaeda itself. So let's be very judicious in how we characterize things. I think that's a legitimate debate. What you call the Boston attack immediately before you even know who is involved at all. I mean, it's just so completely 100% irrelevant to what the response is going to be. I mean, it is just simply let's make the president dance, it does not change anything about the government's response. What he characterizes it immediately. Yeah. And even if he never used the word terrorism at all, before the suspect is even apprehended, it just is 100. I'm sorry to be repetitive. It just makes no impact.
Well, and I think
on how he deals with the situation.
I was sort of taking a little Twitter break for my sanity because look, it wasn't going to do me any good to watch hour after hour after hour of coverage on this. So I drank some Mangria and watched some Big Bang Theory reruns, and would check in occasionally on Twitter. And I saw that Eric Erickson was saying, "Look, hey, give the president a break here. It's not a big deal." So it seems to me like this might have been coming more from the mainstream media. Do you know, Bill, like who was the most vocal and voicing concerns about?
I don't know. I don't. I'm not aware of specific conservative pundits who are pushing the point. There may have been. When
I tuned in, I saw people like Eric Erickson saying, "Hey, back off," This isn't a big deal. But clearly some people were. Look, I think that you have to put it in context of Benghazi, obviously. And that's part of the context. But I don't think it was I don't think it was that big of a deal in this instance, especially since people in the administration quickly said, yes, it was terrorism. In other words, it wasn't like an accident or something.
Right. I mean that you do want to know. Was this a gas leak or was it a bomb? Once you know it's a bomb, that is sufficient information.
But what we still don't know, I don't think we know, Bill. Right? This could. As far as we know, this could have been Al Qaeda or it could have been someone who was just crazy.
Right. I mean,
so in other words, there may not be a
or part of a domestic terrorist ring too. I mean, there could be other terrorism that's not Al Qaeda terrorism.
Okay, but there's domestic terrorism that has a political agenda, which you might assume coming on April 15th, we've heard all of the speculation. But then there's just the sort of random possibility, and so I mean. So, in other words, it would be an intentional act of murder and destruction, but there wouldn't be a political agenda. Now, I think it's highly unlikely that that's the case, but it's, I guess, within the realm of possibility. So that's why I assume that that's part of the reason that President Obama would be careful not to use the word.
Right. I mean, I think people have a interpretation of it that if it's terrorism, that means a group of people did it. But that's not really necessarily the way you have to define the word. I mean, the word would suggest any individual or group who had an agenda of terrorizing a populace. That was the intended goal of the operation, as opposed to being a paranoid schizophrenic who was detached from reality, who had no real goal whatsoever. So it's someone who's just flat out deranged. Maybe you wouldn't call it terrorism then. Right. But obviously the effect of a bomb in a public space is to terrorize a public. So I think the president in the end of the day is saying, look, let's not have a semantic discussion about this. We just call it terrorism in the broadest sense and just be that as it may. And I don't care that he does that, but why it has to be.
I mean, it's a matter of semantics, but at some point, if it is a terrorist attack, it's important that you call it that because words matter. And if you acknowledge that something was a terrorist attack, then that brings with it all sorts of, this really speaks to the question also of whether or not we view something like this as a sort of criminal act, a police act, versus let's suppose that it turns out that this was foreign versus part of a larger global war on terrorism. I mean, that obviously is a big deal in terms of public policy going forward.
Well, and the policy response, once it's clear what the situation is, I mean, that can be debated. I think if this ended up being Al Qaeda, and the president said, Al Qaeda bombed our cities, and now we're going to hunt them down and kill them. That is no. The fact he didn't use the word terrorism in that is still totally in line with how conservatives would like him to respond.
Right.
So who cares whether that specific word was used or not? The question is what are you going to do about it? It has taken the sort of proxy role of the debate between. Do you have just a military-only response, or do you have a more nuanced response? And I don't think the word itself really encapsulates the entirety of that debate.
Good point. We should, now that we've done hypotheticals.
Well, there's no media story here that I know you've been very involved with outside of Boston, which is the Kermit Gosnell murder. Well, it's a murder trial, right?
Yes. I haven't been.
I don't think it's quite accurate to call it an abortion trial. He's not being charged for abortion; he's being charged for murder.
Right.
But he is an abortion doctor, and apparently he hasn't been proven guilty yet. But all the evidence would suggest that he was doing horribly gruesome things that actually involved the killing of live babies. And I know there are a lot of conservatives out there that have said that the media was not giving this story due coverage, and suggesting there was kind of if not a cover-up, a bias of sorts, which I don't totally get, but maybe you want to explain.
Well, first let me say, just in fairness, it's probably not accurate to say that I've been all over this story. I'm not an expert on it, but I've been following it a little bit, and I think that first of all, it's also, I mean, this is a very nuanced situation, but it was actually a liberal, Kirsten Powers, who pushed this story into the mainstream media when she wrote about it at USA Today. Dave Weigel at Slate, I don't think he's a conservative. Wrote some good stuff about it. Connor Friedersdorf at The Atlantic, sort of a libertarian, also Blogging Heads guy, wrote about it. And Melinda Hinterberger, my former editor, who's a pro-life liberal, practicing Catholic, wrote about this at the Washington Post. So I think that the assumption is that this is sort of being pushed by conservatives. I think it's less about liberal media bias than about a sort of secular worldview bias. And what leads me to believe that is because the people who have pushed it, especially Kirsten Powers, who's an evangelical Christian as well as a liberal. I mean, it's unfair to say that conservatives push it because she's the one mainly responsible for driving it into the media. And I do think it's fair to say that there was a lack of coverage. I mean, this story, Bill, without getting into the graphic details, it's horrific. And, we saw the media go, cover the Tiller case in Kansas. We saw them cover Sandra Fluke. Someone on Twitter said the media was much more interested in what Mitt Romney did with scissors 50 years ago than what this doctor did with them a couple years ago. So I do think that it is, that there are conservatives, certainly, who believe that there is a bias here, a media bias. I don't know why, Bill. I think it's a worldview bias. We've talked about this before on the show, that selection bias is one of the more insidious forms of bias. And I think that that there is something about abortion that is sacrosanct, and they did not want to touch it. And I suspect if rather than murdering, he's being tried for murdering babies. So this isn't hyperbole. Rather than murdering babies, if an abortion doctor had been murdered, as was the case with George Tiller, the media would have been all over it, and they certainly wouldn't have described it as one Washington Post reporter did, as a local crime story. So I'd love to get your take on this, Bill, but it does seem to me that this is a story that warranted a lot more coverage than it initially got.
Well, I have a different take on it, and I mean, I feel like the way you just described all that actually, to me, suggests it's not a question of a secular bias. It is the ability of the media to be directed by an organized national push. Sandra Fluke and what was the other one that you mentioned?
George Tiller. But you know what, Bill? Let me also put in there.
Tiller, right?
Let me put in Newtown as well as an example. I mean, horrible, horrific, murder of children that the media covered intensely, and also, in a very sympathetic way toward the children. You don't see that same compassion directed toward these children and toward this story. And
I think that's a different. That's a separate kind of case. Anything that is like a real-time story, cable TV just, eats up.
But why isn't this a real-time story? I mean, he's being tried. The trial, that's what this is about, the trial taking place. And all of this horrific stuff coming out about it that was being reported like in, Philadelphia newspapers.
Well, I think what you have now is, I think when you have national forces that articulate a narrative, why this story has broader implications, then national media tends to respond to that frame. So that's what happened with Tiller. I think it's what happened with Sandra Fluke. I think it's what's happening now with Gosnell, now that that's being done. I mean, there was sporadic coverage of this. Salon had a good roundup of what Gosnell coverage was happening before, this complaint that the media wasn't covering it. You had pro-choice journalists at The Nation, some feminist blogs, CBS, NPR. They'd all done pieces on it, but it was kind of sporadic. It wasn't being put together into a kind of a larger push. So I don't think it's quite that it was totally ignored. But I don't think that a lot of the national media. I realize that Jennifer Rubin sort of mocking it for being a local crime story, and I just think to a lot of people it was a sensational crime story, maybe the kind that gets a lot of coverage on True TV, but since it's not like what is being accused here is currently legal. He's accused of things that are currently illegal. The things that, wherever we are on the abortion debate, no one thinks this is okay. So I don't think it was obvious to the national media why this one has a broader import on the larger abortion debate. Now, conservatives, I think mostly conservatives, or even pro-life liberals, if you want to put them in a separate camp, are connecting some dots like that. But of course, on the pro-choice side, lots of folks saying this is why we don't want to have Roe v. Wade overturned, because you'll see a lot more of this sort of thing if we don't have safe legal abortion. So, so now the story sort of is part of that debate. Well, and it's getting more coverage, which is fine. All right, well, but I don't think.
I think you make some good points there, Bill, and I think I should probably concede that it's not like Fox News or was all over the story either. Having said that, to me the story screams newsworthy because it is about abortion, and I understand what you were just saying, but it involves abortion. Clearly, obviously. And that is an incredibly hot-button issue, political issue in this nation. There have been debates of whether or not there should be more regulation of abortion clinics, of late-term abortion, of whether or not defunding Planned Parenthood. So clearly, there's a political angle to it. There's also the fact that this, I think it was Terry Moran at ABC News who tweeted that that Gosnell may be the most effective mass murderer or serial killer in America. I mean, even if you take aside the abortion angle, this guy was essentially a serial killer, and then collecting feet of babies in a jar. I mean, there were all sorts of things that that should have played into the "if it bleeds, it leads" salacious mentality of news coverage. So there's a political angle, there's the legitimate serial killer angle, there's the salacious. So to me, this should have been a story that that if you're a news hound, if you're out to get attention, page views, ratings, whatever, you should have been all over it. So why weren't they? Well, I think that there is some sort of subtle, we're not going to touch anything that could even be perceived as anti-abortion bias that blinded editors and assignment editors to covering this story. That's my gut. I haven't quite figured it out, but there seems to be some force that made this not seem like a relevant story. It's timely. There's a trial going on. There's so many aspects that should have made this an obvious news story, and yet it wasn't.
Oh, but I feel like once people said, so there's sort of two things. Sometimes people attack the media and say, "You're not focusing on my precious story. The story that's important to me, you're not focusing on. That proves you're biased." And a lot of times that's not good enough. There are a lot of issues out there that have resonance to a niche of people, but an editor might say, not enough of my readership I think cares about this issue, so I'm not going to overdo the resources I put into it. In this case, what folks were saying was, "Hey, editors, this is a tailor-made sensational crime story with all sorts of politics wrapped in it. This is news gold." Right. And the editor said, "Hey, you're right. This is news. I should have done this one. Let's get on it."
Right, but I think that there's a fundamental problem that the reason they didn't get all over it was there was some sort of subtle, unspoken political bias. We're not going to touch this story that clouded their news judgment. But just imagine this, though, Bill. What if a pro-life activist was on trial for killing 10, over the course of 10 years, 10 young, kindergarten children, because, at a daycare center he ran. That, I don't think you could keep the media away from that. So why is this different? Why isn't this equally newsworthy?
Actually, we have the child care thing, because there's this cover story in the New Republic this week called "The Hell of American Daycare," which leads with this absolutely horrible story of a poorly regulated Texas daycare where the woman running it, I think she had a criminal record, apparently left the premises with the stove on to go to Target. And the place went on fire, and lots of kids were killed. It's absolutely horrific. And the point, it's a bigger expose of sort of the history of American daycare, and it makes a liberal point at the end. We should be investing in safe and regulated, high quality childcare. But that's not the conclusion you draw from it all. He was connecting a lot of dots, saying, look, there's all of these horrible childcare facilities out there that aren't getting that much attention and aren't building to a groundswell for the government to do something about. I imagine on a given day there's all sorts of horrible stuff going on, and editors are choosing which ones, if you're at the national level, which ones make the sort of the national cut.
All right, well, let me stop you there, Bill, because I think you're right. But let me give you an example of something that did make the cut. The New York Times. Two things. On Sunday, their lead editorial, not about Gosnell. It's about George Tiller, this late-term abortionist who was murdered, and of course we condemn that. But his clinic in Wichita is opening. That story warranted a lead editorial. The next day, Bill, here's a story that warranted on Monday a front-page New York Times story. This is a front-page New York Times story. And it's about how premature babies respond well to music, like the Beatles. And if babies are born premature, then playing them music will make them smarter or happier or whatever. It's a fine story, Bill. That's a front-page story. And guess what isn't on the front page in the New York Times? The Gosnell story about a serial killer killing babies. Now, how in the world, if you are an assignment editor for arguably the most important newspaper in the world, in the context of the Gosnell stories before Boston, and the context of the Gosnell story being the story of the week, at least in terms of media coverage, how on earth do you decide as a New York Times editor to run a front-page story about babies, premature babies responding to music, when babies the exact same age are being murdered and they're not worthy of front-page coverage? That blows me away, Bill. And it goes to the editorial judgment, and I think a worldview, I'd like to think this wasn't an intentional slight, but a complete worldview bias, out of touch reporters and editors.
Well, there's just a little background on the Times. So the Times actually had a Gosnell story last month before all this, but it was not front page. It was page 17. And their public editor, the Times is a public editor now, who's now Margaret Sullivan. The Times for a long time didn't have an ombudsman role. They were sort of anti-navel gazing. Their attitude was like, this is the New York Times, this is the paper, this is our news judgment. If you don't like it, go buy another paper. We're not going to go analyzing what we're doing. But last several years they've succumbed, and they're now doing that. So there was a piece that was done by Sullivan 2 days ago. I think it was just online. I don't think it was in the paper. But she adds, her conclusion after sort of laying out the relative lack of coverage. She says that the behavior of news organizations often owes more to chaos theory than conspiracy theory. I don't think that editors and reporters got together and decided not to give the Gosnell trial a lot of attention because it would highlight the evils of abortion. I do think that it was not on their radar screen and that it should have been. The murders of 7 newborn babies, done so horrifically, would be no ordinary crime. Any suggestion, including mine on Friday, that this is just another murder trial is a miscalculation, and it's certainly possible that journalists who are more in touch with conservative voices and causes would have picked up on the importance of this trial sooner. Judged on news value alone, the Gosnell trial deserves more coverage than it's had in the Times and elsewhere. Those who call for more attention to this grisly and disturbing trial are right. But some of them, because their accusations of politics overcoming the news judgment, are right for the wrong reason. So I think what she is saying is in line with what you're saying.
I think so. I think so too, Bill. But my concern is that it's one thing to retroactively acknowledge that they should have been aware. I'm arguing that there is something under the skin of the mainstream media that the real problem is what caused them not to be attuned to this story, and addressing that so that in the future they are more sensitive and attuned to stories that are clearly newsworthy, but for which their selection bias prohibits them from covering. And I don't know if there's that sort of introspection going on. It's one thing to retroactively acknowledge that they should have been covering it, but is there any sort of soul searching as to, the institutions or the maybe the people that they hire that could correct this in the future and prevent this sort of ignorance from happening again?
Well, perhaps we should leave it on that note.
Well, we can end it there. But I have to tell you, the commenters lately have turned against me, Bill, and I suspect that this week we may see more of the same. They think that I'm paranoid, crazy right winger. So,
if there's anything, Matt, I would defend you against is being accused of being paranoid and crazy.
Well, you did say that when they come to get me, when they knock on my door and come to get me, that you will vouch for me. So,
well, when they come to get you, I'll be on the other side of town. But until that point,
another good show.
Always going to talk to you, Matt.
Likewise.
And I'll be away next week. I don't know what you want to do while I'm in absentia.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I heard from someone I talked to that they listen to us every Friday on their way home from work. That they listen to this show or the podcast. So we got to keep the audience alerted. We don't know if we'll do this next week or not. Maybe we'll have a substitute. But Bill will not be here, so it probably won't be worth listening to if you're a huge Bill fan.
There are plenty of fine. You've had plenty of fine discussions with when I've been gone.
All right, man. Well, have a good one, and we'll talk to you in 2 weeks, I guess.